Hey groupers, Pastor Marshall. I'm glad that you're here. I hope that you had a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. I'm excited because we're back on track in the Gospel of Luke. We're in Luke chapter 19. The triumphal entry of Jesus is what we're talking about this weekend. To get the ice broken, to get your conversation started in group, to get everybody talking, answer this question. Have you ever been in a parade? What is the closest that you have ever come to being the center of attention and a crowd was focused on you? And I don't mean your wedding day. Have you ever been the center of a huge event and the crowd was focused on you? What was that like? What was the event? Share that in your group. And our funerals don't count. We haven't had those yet. We all know that we will be the center of attention on that day. But while we're still breathing, we're not doing that. Well, then I want you to talk about this after you've got the ice broken and you're talking. What are your first thoughts as we start the first day of the last week of the life of Jesus on earth? We're beginning the Passion of Christ. We're going to spend a few months here before we finish. But what are you thinking about right now as we turn the page and we begin Sunday, Palm Sunday, the last week of Jesus' normal life on earth? Are you excited? Are you scared? Are you angry? This is the most important week in the history of the world. This is going to culminate in the most important day in the history of the world. Richard Nixon proclaimed on public television when we landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969, that it was the most important day since the creation of the world. It wasn't too long after that he got a call from his good friend and spiritual advisor, Billy Graham. And Billy Graham said to him, "Mr. President, I beg to differ, but the greatest day in the history of the world is the day that Jesus Christ died on a cross for the sins of mankind." Well, we're starting the last week of Jesus' life, his normal life, that's going to culminate in his death on the cross. And I'm wondering, what are you thinking about right now at the beginning? Share that with your group. Next, what I would love to do is for your group to go back and to look at the passages that I referenced in my message on this last weekend. There's a lot of things in this triumphal entry that are foreshadowed in the Old Testament, and I think it'd be great to dig into those passages. So turn to Zechariah chapter 14, verse 4. In that passage, the prophet Zechariah talks about the Messiah is going to be on the Mount of Olives. How obscure is that passage? Look it up and you decide. And then before you leave Zechariah, because it's a hard book to find, turn back to chapter 9, verse 9, and read about how the prophet also talks about how the king is going to be coming on a donkey. And how not obscure is that? It's very specific. And then turn to Psalm 118, especially verse 26. This psalm is a messianic psalm. Even the rabbis in Jesus' day believed that it was messianic. It would turn out to be the most quoted psalm in the New Testament. But here we have the words that are on the lips of the crowds as they praise Jesus as he comes down the Mount of Olives riding on a donkey. And then finally, 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 13 says that they were laying the cloaks on the ground in front of the king as he was coming into Jerusalem. Look up those passages. I believe that this event has been orchestrated by Jesus on purpose to display his true role as the King of Israel. What do you believe? Do you believe that Jesus is behind all of this, that he has set this up so that he can establish himself? Or do you think that his followers have set this up and Jesus has just gotten caught up in this parade? Talk about that. Next, I want you to notice what Jesus says that's only recorded here in Luke. Remember, the Pharisees told Jesus that he should make his disciples stop praising him, that this was a mistake. And Jesus said, "No, if my disciples don't praise me, then the stones will cry out and they will praise me." What a beautiful picture of nature being a part of God's design and being alive. And I wonder what you think about nature being alive. I want you to turn back again to Psalm 148, another passage in the Old Testament. I want you to focus on verses 1 through 10 and read about what the psalmist writes about all the different parts of nature that are praising God. And notice that mankind is not mentioned until verse 11. It's so beautiful. Nature is praising God before we are. It's as if we're slow on the upstart. It's as if we're late in getting involved in the game. I think that you should talk about that. What do you think about nature praising God? Remember Genesis 4, Cain has killed Abel. God comes into the picture and says that the blood of Abel cries out to God from the ground. I also told you about Habakkuk chapter 2, and this passage there are these buildings, the city that has been built on the hands of illicit gain, on slave labor, and God says that the stones and the timbers of the buildings are crying out because of the injustice that has happened. Well, I want you to look at Psalm 148, and then I want you to turn to the New Testament, and I want you to look at Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 22. Romans chapter 8, potentially the greatest chapter in the entire Bible. But here, it talks about nature being involved. What do you think about creation being a part of worship? And how is the church doing on creation? How often do you think about creation being a part when you have a pet or when you go out in nature? Should the church do more with creation than we're doing? Well, I think that you'll have good conversations about that. I always want you to talk about what is your favorite thing in the passage. My favorite thing in this passage is the Mount of Olives. When I got to visit the Holy Lands, I got to visit the Mount of Olives, and it was one of my most favorite places on our entire trip to Israel. There are still olive trees that are growing there that are over 2,000 years old. So they were there the time of Jesus. They were there when this happened. There's one olive tree there that I'll show you a picture of here in the video that is 3,000 years old, which means that it was not only there when Jesus was there, but it was a big tree. It was actually there when King David was there, and it was a good-sized tree. One of my most favorite places, the Mount of Olives. And then I want you to talk about what you don't like. I have a feeling that we're all going to not like the exact same thing, is that we don't like the Pharisees. Here comes this epic event in the life of Jesus, this high point before we all go downhill to the low point, his death on the cross. And the Pharisees say, stop it. They shouldn't be praising. I bet you don't like that. I don't like it. And then a reminder about the application for this week's text, because in the middle of the week, maybe you need to pick up commitments that you made on Sunday. There are 3 responses to Jesus in this passage. The first response are the owners of the colt. And it's this beautiful picture of what is mine is the Lord's. What I have is yours. And maybe you made a commitment on Sunday to be less clutching of your stuff, to be more generous with your stuff for the kingdom use. The second response is praise. And here's all of these people in this parade that are praising Jesus. And I talked about on this last weekend that there still is a hesitancy, especially among men, to be publicly praising Jesus. We have some machismo, or we're worried about what our voice sounds like, and instead of it being an audience of one, God, in the worship setting, we're really concerned about what people around us are thinking and doing. And I challenge you to let that go, to make a step towards praise. The third response, of course, is the response of the Pharisees. And that's the response that looks at people that are praising Jesus and says, hush it. And maybe you have some of that in you, that you have some repenting to do. Well, I hope that you have a great group. I'll see you this next weekend when we talk about the emotions of Jesus. God bless.